The town that was erased overnight. Dear viewers, welcome to my channel. Now I am going to tell you the true story. The town that was erased overnight. The people of that city went to sleep believing tomorrow would be ordinary. The streets were quiet. Porch lights flickered against wooden houses. A dog barked somewhere in the dark. The Missouri River moved slowly, as it had for thousands of years, indifferent to the fragile lives built along its banks. By sunrise, the town would no longer exist. This is not a legend. This is not folklore. This happened in America, and almost no one talks about it. In the summer of 1952, the small farming town of Riverton, Kansas, was the kind of place where nothing ever changed. Population, just under 600. Main Street had a hardware store, a diner, a post office, and a church whose white steeple could be seen from miles away across the wheat fields. People knew each other's birthdays. They knew who was behind on mortgage payments. They knew which families had lost sons in World War II. It was quiet, predictable, safe. But Riverton had been built in the wrong place. For decades, the Army Corps of Engineers had studied the Missouri River Basin. Flooding had devastated communities repeatedly in the early 20th century. Entire counties had been submerged in the great floods of 1903 and 1943. Washington had a solution: dams, massive modern concrete walls to tame the wild rivers of the Midwest. It was called the Sloan Plan. To most Americans, it sounded like progress. To towns like Riverton, it was a death sentence. The letter arrived in March. It was typed, official, clinical. The government would be constructing a reservoir as part of a federal flood control and hydroelectric power initiative. The valleys surrounding Riverton would be submerged within 18 months. Residents would be compensated. They would need to relocate. The church, the cemetery, the school, the homes, all of it would disappear beneath water. At first, people didn't believe it. You don't erase a town. You don't simply drown generations of memory. But surveyors arrived, then engineers, then federal officials with maps marked in blue ink, water lines drawn directly through kitchens and bedrooms. The dam would be built downstream. When the gates closed, the river would rise slowly, methodically, swallowing everything. There would be no dramatic wave, no sudden catastrophe, just water, relentless and patient. Some families left immediately. Others refused. Old Mr. Halbrook, who had fought in World War I, said he would die in his house before letting Washington push him out. He had built that home with his own hands in 1919. He had buried his wife in the hilltop cemetery. You can't flood the dead, he told the county officer. But they could, and they would. Throughout 1952 and 1953, Riverton existed in a strange, suspended state. Children still attended school. Crops were still planted. But everyone knew the clock was ticking. Businesses stopped repairing buildings. Why fix a roof that would soon sit under 20 feet of water? Why paint a house that would be demolished or abandoned? The town began to decay before it even drowned. The slow psychological erosion. The cemetery was the hardest. Federal policy required relocation of graves. One by one, caskets were exhumed. Wood splintered in the damp soil. Names long forgotten resurfaced in newspaper columns. Families gathered to rebury ancestors on higher ground. It felt like disturbing something sacred. The past was being forced to move. By the summer of 1953, only a handful of families remained. The dam was complete. Engineers announced the gates would close on August 14. Residents were given final evacuation dates. Compensation checks had been mailed. The government trucks came to remove anything salvageable: utility poles, signage, even parts of buildings that could be repurposed elsewhere. Main Street became hollow. Windows shattered from wind, doors hung open. The diner's counters still held salt shakers, as if customers might return. They wouldn't. On the final night, only 12 people remained in Riverton. Reporters from Kansas City drove in to document what they called the drowning of a town. It sounded poetic. It wasn't. It was administrative. At dawn, the dam gates closed. Downstream, turbines hummed to life. Upstream, the river began to change. At first, nothing looked different. Then the current slowed. Then the water widened. Fields nearest the bank darkened as groundwater rose beneath them. Within days, low-lying farmland disappeared. Within weeks, streets turned into canals. Residents who had relocated to nearby hills watched from a distance as their former town slowly transformed into a reflection. Church steeple first, then rooftops, then chimneys, finally nothing. By October 1953, Riverton, Kansas was gone. In its place was a reservoir stretching miles across what had once been neighborhoods, gardens, and playgrounds. Boats floated where children had walked to school. Fishermen cast lines above submerged attics. On very clear days, when water levels dropped during drought years, something eerie happened. Foundations emerged, brick outlines, the faint grid of streets beneath the surface. Divers who later explored the reservoir described it as a ghost town preserved in green silence. Houses collapsed inward, dishes still in cabinets, rusted bicycles lying in what used to be driveways. Time had stopped, underwater. And Riverton was not alone. Across the United States, dozens of towns were sacrificed for dams during the mid-20th century. Some in Missouri, some in South Dakota, some in Montana. Entire communities erased in the name of progress. The maps were updated, the names faded, but the people remembered. Today, most Americans drive across reservoirs without knowing what lies beneath. They see water, they see recreation, they see development. They do not see kitchens, they do not see school desks, they do not see the hill where Mr. Wilson, Halbrook, once stood, watching the river he had known all his life transform into something unrecognizable. History often remembers wars, presidents, battles, but it rarely remembers the quiet disappearances. The towns that simply stopped. Not from fire, not from plague, but from paperwork. And if you ever find yourself standing beside a calm American reservoir at sunset, watching the surface shimmer in orange light, consider this. You may not be looking at water. You may be looking at rooftops. The water looked peaceful from a distance. That was the strangest part. By the spring of 1954, the newly formed reservoir stretched across miles of what had once been farms, gravel roads, and kitchen gardens. Sunlight shimmered on its surface. Pelicans began nesting along the shoreline. Fishing boats appeared. To outsiders, it was beautiful. To the displaced, it was a mirror. And beneath that mirror lay not just Riverton, but dozens of American communities sacrificed to an ambitious federal blueprint known as the Sloan Plan. The Missouri River had always been unpredictable. Lewis and Clark wrote about its violent currents in 1804. Steamboats capsized in the 19th century. Floods swallowed entire counties in 1881, 1903, and again in 1943. The river was called Big Muddy for a reason. After the catastrophic flood of 1943, which devastated farmland across Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, and Nebraska, Congress decided something drastic had to be done. Two separate proposals emerged. One from Colonel Lewis Pick of the Army Corps of Engineers, focused on flood control and navigation. The other from William Glenn Sloan of the Bureau of Reclamation, focused on irrigation and hydroelectric power. In 1944, Congress merged them into a single massive infrastructure strategy, the Sloan Missouri Basin Program. On paper, it was visionary. It promised electricity for rural America. It promised flood protection. It promised economic growth. What it did not promise, at least not loudly, was the elimination of entire towns. Across the Missouri River Basin, construction crews began building a chain of colossal dams. Fort Randall, Gavins, Point, Oahe, Garrison, Big Bend. Concrete walls rising hundreds of feet high, holding back billions of gallons of water. Each dam required a reservoir. Each reservoir required land, and that land was not empty. It held homes, churches, grain elevators, cemeteries, memories layered decade upon decade. In South Dakota, the creation of Lake Oahe would submerge more than 200,000 acres of land. In North Dakota, the Garrison Dam would flood the town of Van Hook entirely. In Missouri, communities like Stull and others along the riverbank were forced into relocation negotiations that dragged on for years. But perhaps the most controversial impact fell upon Native American reservations. More than 550 square miles of tribal land, primarily belonging to the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, were flooded by the Garrison Dam project alone. The Fort Berthold Reservation lost fertile bottomland that had sustained families for generations. Compensation was delayed. Negotiations were unequal. Many tribal leaders later described it as one of the greatest unspoken losses in modern American history. The river had been controlled, but the cost had been uneven. Meanwhile, newspapers celebrated progress. Photographs showed proud engineers standing beside turbines. Headlines praised the dawn of modern flood control. President Harry Truman endorsed the project as a symbol of post-war American strength. Electric lights turned on in rural farmhouses that had never known them before. Cities downstream felt safer. The dams worked. Flood damage decreased significantly in many areas. Hydroelectric power surged into the grid. Economically, the plan succeeded. Emotionally, it fractured something quieter. Back at Riverton's former location, life had reorganized itself on higher ground. A new town had been constructed 2 miles west. The government called it New Riverton. The residents simply called it The Hill. Houses were rebuilt with standardized blueprints. The streets were wider. The lots were evenly measured. Everything felt cleaner. But something was missing. The new church lacked the creak of the old wooden pews. The new cemetery had orderly rows, but no ancient oak tree shading the stones. The new Main Street had fewer businesses. People commuted elsewhere now. The heart of the town had not relocated. It had dissolved. Psychologists decades later would study communities displaced by dam projects and find recurring patterns: loss of identity, economic stagnation, depression rates rising in older populations. The trauma wasn't explosive like a hurricane. It was quiet, administrative, signed into existence by ink. In 1965, during a particularly dry summer, water levels at the reservoir dropped nearly 15 feet. Local teenagers exploring the shoreline reported seeing brick foundations protruding from the mud. An old stairwell, sections of sidewalk. News spread quickly. Former residents returned with cameras. One woman, now in her 70s, walked on to what had once been her front yard. She stood in silence for several minutes. "There used to be roses here," she said. The lake eventually rose again. The ruins disappeared. But the moment lingered. The river, it seemed, had not completely erased the town. It remembered. By the 1970s, scuba divers began exploring submerged towns across America. In Lake Lanier, Georgia, in Lake Mead, Nevada, in Kentucky's Lake Cumberland. They described streets intact beneath murky water, school buses resting on silt, telephone poles leaning like forgotten monuments. The preservation effect of fresh water sometimes slowed decay. Objects were frozen in time, dinner plates still stacked, wallpaper clinging to damp walls, clocks permanently stopped at whatever hour the water first entered. Underwater photographers later captured haunting images. Staircases descending into green darkness, church doors slightly ajar, windows shattered by pressure. It was not destruction in the dramatic sense. It was suspension. Yet despite the emotional toll, many historians argue that the Sloan Plan helped prevent billions of dollars in flood damage over the decades. Cities like Omaha and Kansas City benefited from regulated river flow. Agricultural irrigation expanded. Hydropower generated renewable energy long before environmentalism became mainstream. This is the paradox of American progress. It often works, rarely asks everyone equally. In recent years, as climate change intensifies extreme weather patterns, discussions about dam infrastructure have resurfaced. Some aging dams are now being dismantled to restore ecosystems. Others remain critical for flood control. The same nation that once rushed to build them is now reconsidering their long-term consequences. History moves in cycles. Rivers do too. If you visit one of these reservoirs today, you might see families grilling on the shore, jet skis cutting across the surface, children laughing. You would not immediately sense loss. But if you stay long enough, if the wind quiets and the water smooths into glass, you may feel something else. A subtle weight, a stillness that feels layered. Because beneath that calm surface are foundations, door frames, footsteps preserved in mud, American towns that did not burn, crumble, did not fail. They were chosen to disappear so others could remain. And perhaps that is the most American part of the story. Not the dam, not the engineering marvel, but the quiet agreement, spoken or unspoken, that progress sometimes demands surrender. Riverton surrendered. Van Hook surrendered. Dozens more surrendered. The river flows on. The turbines hum. Lights glow in distant cities, and beneath the water, streets wait in silence. There is a photograph taken in the spring of 1952. It shows a small wooden schoolhouse standing beneath a wide Midwestern sky. The paint is peeling slightly. The flag in front is caught in a soft breeze. 8 children stand on the steps, squinting at the camera. Their teacher, Miss Eleanor Whitaker, stands behind them, hands folded, expression calm but distant. None of them knew the building would not survive the year. The photograph was found decades later in a cardboard box labeled simply, "Before the Water." Miss Whitaker arrived in Riverton in 1947, fresh from Teachers College in Topeka. She was 24 years old, unmarried, and determined to bring the wider world into a town that barely appeared on maps. Her classroom had one blackboard, a coal stove for winter, and shelves filled with donated textbooks, many already 10 years outdated. She taught grades 1 through 8 in the same room. Older students helped younger ones with reading. At recess, they played baseball in a field bordered by cottonwood trees. When the federal notice arrived announcing the reservoir project, it was delivered to the post office first. News spread by evening. The next morning, Miss Whitaker noticed something unusual. The children were quiet. Even the youngest sensed it. Adults had whispered too loudly the night before. The government officials held a town meeting inside the church basement. Folding chairs filled every corner. Farmers stood along the walls. The Corps of Engineers displayed large maps pinned to corkboards. Blue shading covered nearly the entire valley. Someone asked how high the water would rise. Another asked about compensation. Halbrook, his voice trembling with age and anger, asked a different question. "Where do you expect us to put the dead?" There was no applause, no shouting, only the sound of papers being shuffled and cleared throats. Progress had its script. Emotion did not. Over the following months, daily life continued, but with an undercurrent of countdown. Miss Whitaker began assigning unusual projects. Instead of arithmetic drills, she asked her students to write essays about their homes. Describe your kitchen table, she told them. Write about the sound the porch makes when someone steps on it. Draw the road you walk to school. One boy, Thomas Reed, drew the river, not as a threat, but as a companion. He wrote in careful pencil, "The river sounds different at night. It breathes." Miss Whitaker kept that paper. She did not yet know why. By autumn, survey stakes dotted the outskirts of town. Bright ribbons marked future water lines. The children asked if the lake would have fish. "Yes," she said softly. "Will our school float?" "No," she answered. The government offered to relocate the building, but structural reports deemed it too fragile to move intact. It would be dismantled, brick by brick, board by board. The bell would be removed and placed in the new school up the hill. That was the compromise. A bell without a building. Winter came early in 1952. Snow covered the valley in deceptive beauty. For a few months, the water threat felt distant. The river froze at the edges. Families gathered for Christmas, knowing it would be their last in those homes. Miss Whitaker attended every school family's holiday supper that year. She drank coffee at 6 different tables over 3 nights. She began noticing the way adults paused in doorways, the way they ran their hands along walls as if memorizing texture, the way conversations drifted into silence mid-sentence. Loss was no longer theoretical. It had entered the room. In March 1953, demolition crews arrived. A hardware store came down first, then the diner. The sound of wood splintering echoed through empty streets. The school was scheduled last. Miss Whitaker requested permission to hold one final class inside. It was granted. On May 14, 1953, 8 children sat at their desks for the last time. There was no formal lesson. Instead, she rang the bell slowly. Clear, steady. The sound drifted across open windows into a town already half dismantled. History, she told them gently, is not only what is written in books. It is what you carry forward. She gave each student a folded piece of paper, their essays from months earlier. "Keep this," she said, "even if the house is gone." When the final dismissal came, no one rushed outside. They stood. They listened, as if waiting for the building itself to speak. 2 weeks later, workers removed the bell. The wooden structure was torn apart within days. The valley looked increasingly skeletal. Only foundations remained, like ribs beneath soil. When the dam gates closed that August, Miss Whitaker stood with the Reeds on a hill overlooking the slow expansion of water. Thomas held her hand. He was 12 now, old enough to understand. The river widened silently. It crept over fields. It swallowed fence posts. It reached the former edge of town by September. By October, only the church steeple remained visible. Then that too vanished. Thomas whispered, "It's still breathing." Miss Whitaker did not correct him. Years passed. Unevenly. Some families moved away entirely. Thomas grew older, enlisted in the Air Force, and left Kansas behind. Miss Whitaker continued teaching in the new schoolhouse, where the old bell hung in a brighter hallway. Every morning, she rang it once, clear, steady. Students who had never seen the original building heard it without knowing its weight. In 1978, during a drought, water levels dropped significantly. Miss Whitaker, now retired and gray-haired, received a phone call. "They say the old school foundation is visible," someone told her. She drove to the shoreline alone. Mud stretched where water once lay. Broken bricks protruded from earth. She walked carefully, step by step, until she stood where the doorway had once been. She closed her eyes, and in that silence she could almost hear it. The scrape of chairs, the shuffle of notebooks, children laughing at recess. The bell, always the bell. She knelt and pressed her palm against one exposed brick. It was warm from sunlight. Not drowned, not erased, only waiting. Historians would later debate the moral calculus of the Sloan dams. Economists would cite flood prevention statistics. Engineers would point to megawatts generated annually. Environmentalists would discuss altered ecosystems and displaced wildlife. All of it mattered, all of it was true, but none of it fully captured the sound of a school bell ringing for the last time in a valley about to disappear. Today, if you visit the reservoir in late summer, when water recedes slightly, locals might tell you where the old town once stood. They speak casually, pointing toward open water. Right about there. Coordinates without streets, memory without structure. The bell from Riverton still hangs in the modern school. It is polished now, mounted on a metal frame. Children tap it playfully during events. They do not know that once, long ago, its echo drifted across a town preparing for surrender. But perhaps they feel something, a tone that lingers a fraction longer than expected, a vibration that carries more than sound. Because history does not vanish when submerged. It settles, layer by layer, like silt at the bottom of a reservoir, quiet, patient, breathing beneath the surface.